Hello there, I'm Toby Hadoke, and when the whispering starts, it's death, I tell you. Death. Welcome to Too Much Information, which aims to tell you the who, what and when of Doctor Who, a television programme about intellect and cleverness, how they can cause problems, both witting and unwitting, but more importantly, how they can be used to overcome those problems. Whether you're discovering the episodes for the very first time, or you know your Professor Marius's from your scientist Darius's, then you're extremely welcome on this odyssey behind the scenes, which aims to go through the series one episode at a time. In this edition, it's an episode which not only focuses squarely on Ian and Barbara, but also has to be defended against allegations of skullduggery in the writing process. So join me, Toby Hadoke, as I give you the who, what and when of Doctor Who, the Screaming Jungle, or It's in the Trees, It's Coming. First broadcast 25th of April 1964 at 5:30 p.m. It starred William Hartnell as Doctor Who, William Russell as Ian Chesterton, Jacqueline Hill as Barbara Wright, and Carol Ann Ford as Susan Foreman, with guest stars Robin Phillips as Altos and Catherine Schofield as Sabitha. It was written by Terry Nation, produced by Verity Lambert, and directed by John Gorrie. It was watched by 9.9 million people, and the audience appreciation was 61. Ian, Barbara, Sabitha and Altos arrive in a ruin that lies deep within a dense jungle. There they find Susan, who has been overwhelmed by strange noises that have now ceased, and is being terrorised by plant life that seems to move with a mind of its own. Barbara spies the conscience key hanging from a strange idol set into a wall, but when she goes to retrieve it, the wall rotates, separating her from her friends. To make matters worse, Sabitha realises that the key Barbara found is a fake. Worried that Barbara may have activated her travel dial, Ian volunteers to look for the real key while the others jump ahead to the next destination. But the hostile jungle is closing in, traps are everywhere, and only one suspicious old man holds the secret of the key's true location. The When. 16th of September 1963. Story editor David Whittaker amends the running order for Doctor Who's first season to add a 4-part story by Robert Gould as the year's 4th adventure, following The Tribe of Gum and The Robots, both by Anthony Coburn, and John Lucarotti's A Journey to Cathay. Gould will make a second attempt at the minuscule story, which C.E. Webber had previously been developing as The Giants. At one stage, it was intended to launch Doctor Who, only to be abandoned in July. 7th of January 1964. Gould's minuscule story is removed from the schedule. At this stage, The Hidden Planet by Malcolm Hulke is intended to follow Marco Polo, as A Journey to Cathay has now been renamed, and occupy the 5th slot in the season schedule, since Whittaker's own The Edge of Destruction has been inserted as Story 3. However, as we discussed in the Too Much Information for the first episode of The Keys of Marinus, The Sea of Death, it won't be long before The Hidden Planet is dropped from the production plans as well. 3rd of February 1964. The Keys of Marinus is now being developed by Terry Nation as the new Story 5. He and Whittaker meet this day at Nation's London flat, where they urgently rough out the details for the first 4 instalments. With regards to Episode 3, Whittaker explains in a 26th of March memo to Donald Wilson, the BBC's head of serials, that it began with a suggestion from me that Nation wrote a House That Jack Built story. Some house or place that was full of booby traps. Since episodes 1 and 2 had been basically interior sets, he wished to tell a story more out in the open to give the designer a chance for different settings. It was Nation's own idea to speed up nature's process and have some of our principal artists battling with vegetation rather than with alien people. We'll hear more from that 26th of March memo shortly. But first, A reasonable question to ask at this stage is what exactly the house that Jack built has to do with a booby-trapped house. After all, the house that Jack built is a nursery rhyme, first published in the mid-18th century, that describes the malt, rat, cat, dog, cow, maiden, man, priest, cock, farmer, and sometimes also horse, hound, and horn associated with the titular domicile. But never, unless there's a particularly astonishing regional variation that we've yet to come across, the decapitating statue in its courtyard, or the barbed ceiling that lies just beyond its front door. The best guess that Too Much Information has come up with is that the cumulative nature of the nursery rhyme put David Whittaker in mind of the work of Rube Goldberg, the American cartoonist who became famous for his diagrams of comically complex machines and inventions, such as 1931's Professor Butts and the self-operating napkin. But we admit that's a bit of a stretch. Whittaker may well have just made a mistake, or perhaps nursery rhymes in the Whittaker household were given a slightly more sinister spin. 4th of February, 1964. Whittaker meets with Robert Gould. They discuss the challenges posed by the minuscule script and ultimately decide to drop the concept, with Whittaker instead asking Gould to devise a brand new idea. According to Whittaker's 26th of March memo to Donald Wilson, Gould said he had an idea where plants treated people as people treat plants, and would let me know if it worked out. Whittaker subsequently runs this notion by producer Verity Lambert, who expresses reservations that it might be seen as too similar to John Wyndham's classic 1951 science fiction novel The Day of the Triffids, which had been adapted as a film less than 2 years earlier. A film which had featured Carol Ann Ford. 9th of February, 1964. Robert Gould informs David Whittaker that he has decided against developing his proposed plants versus people story. 17th of February 1964. Terry Nation delivers episodes 3 and 4 of The Keys of Marinus, now called The Screaming Jungle and The Snows of Terror. 27th of February 1964. Edmund Warwick is contracted to play the role of Darius. A veteran of programmes like Potts in Perovia and The Adventures of Robin Hood, Warwick has worked with William Russell before on a 1956 episode of The Adventures of Sir Lancelot. 17th of March, 1964. A plan has been put in place to allow each of the 4 Doctor Who regulars to take a fortnight's holiday at different points in the production calendar. As a result, William Hartnell will be absent from both The Screaming Jungle and The Snows of Terror. David Whittaker amends episode 4 on this day to replace the Doctor with Altos, a character originally intended only for episode 2, The Velvet Web. He presumably revises episode 3 on or around this date as well. 18th of March, 1964. The production office provides Raymond Cusick with the information he needs to start designing the sets for The Screaming Jungle. This is happening well behind schedule. BBC protocol dictates that Cusick should have been in a position to start working on his designs nearly a week ago, and the design drawings are meant to be ready tomorrow. Instead, Cusick will deliver them on the 24th of March, just 10 days before recording. To make matters worse, with the Good Friday and Easter Monday holidays occurring on the 27th of March and the 30th of March, the design department will be left with just 2 days for the actual construction of the sets. 26th of March, 1964. This is the date of David Whittaker's memo to Donald Wilson. It is written because Robert Gould has levied an allegation of plagiarism at the Doctor Who production office. Having somehow got wind of the hostile plant life at the heart of The Screaming Jungle, he has accused Whittaker of taking inspiration from Gould's own plants versus people story idea. However, Whittaker's timeline of events plainly refutes this challenge, since the encroaching vegetation was not only Terry Nation's suggestion, but had also formed part of their script conversation on the 3rd of February, the day before Whittaker's meeting with Gould. Terry Nation is prepared to write you himself with the relevant dates in confirmation of this, if necessary, assures Whittaker, who has already discussed the matter with Nation by telephone this morning. In conclusion, I can only say that Robert Gould at no time discussed his idea in any detail with me. 30th of March, 1964. The first of 4 rehearsal days for The Screaming Jungle, all held at the Territorial Army Drill Hall on Uxbridge Road. William Hartnell has now departed on his holidays. Apart from Edmund Warwick as Darius, the rest of the guest cast for this episode have already appeared in The Keys of Marinus. Catherine Schofield and Robin Phillips are back as Sabitha and Altos, whilst Martin Court, who had been one of the Vord in The Sea of Death, returns to the serial in a new role. He's now the statue that nearly cleaves Ian in two, credited as Warrior on the finished programme, but designated the more visceral Hatchet Man in the script. Uncredited as the arms of the idol that ensnares Barbara is Bob Hadoke, who had been one of the cavemen in An Unearthly Child. Unfortunately, the idol's design means that Hadoke is unable to see out of the prop when he's supposed to grab Barbara and later Ian. As a result, during one rehearsal, he has a rather closer encounter with Jacqueline Hill than the action dictates, which probably isn't indicative of the kind of screaming jungle that Terry Nation had in mind. To avoid a disastrous recurrence of this mishap on camera, the staging is reworked to have Barbara standing well up on the statue, thereby ensuring that the statue's hands will be nearer her ankles than, well, anything more snug. 3rd of April, 1964. The Screaming Jungle is recorded in Lime Grove Studio D between 8 and 9:45 p.m. 9th of April, 1964. Terence Cook, the organiser for the serials department, which includes Doctor Who, writes to James Moody, the BBC's head of scenic servicing. Cook is unhappy with the quality of the sets built for the Screaming Jungle. Moody responds on the 14th of April to attribute the problem to the late start that Raymond Cusick was forced to make on the episode. Moody retorts, "We had to choose between doing the best job in the limited time available or simply do nothing. We chose the former, but perhaps we were unwise." 24th of April, 1964. Edmund Warwick replies to John Gorrie, who has sent his thanks for Warwick's performance as Darius. "How very kind of you to write to me," Warwick says. "I thoroughly enjoyed my week with Doctor Who and was sorry to be out of it so soon." After discussing his recent role as a crook in No Hiding Place, Warwick goes on to say, "I do hope something else turns up in Doctor Who that I could play for you, in disguise, of course." Warwick's wish will be granted, not once, but twice. Having helped fill the eccentric old man quota in William Hartnell's absence for the Screaming Jungle, he'll do so again in Part 4 of the Dalek Invasion of Earth, this time substituting for Hartnell as the Doctor himself to provide the series' star time to recover from an injury suffered during rehearsals for the preceding episode. And then, to top it all off, Warwick and Hartnell will come face to face in Part 5 of The Chase, with Warwick doubling as both the Doctor and his Dalek-created robotic doppelganger, depending upon the requirements of each shot. 25th of April, 1964. Precisely as scheduled, The Screaming Jungle is broadcast at 5:30 p.m. BBC Two has now launched, although its intended debut on the 20th of April is limited to news bulletins when a fire at Battersea Power Station causes a power failure at Television Centre, and so Doctor Who's transmission home has been rebranded BBC One. The 500,000 viewers who missed the Velvet Web last week return, bringing the audience figure back to the same 9.9 million who had watched The Sea of Death. And that's once again good for 22nd place in the charts. The appreciation figure splits the difference of the first two instalments. Having been 62 for Episode 1 and 60 for Episode 2, it settles in at 61. The What? Well, the headline news this week is that despite William Hartnell still receiving top billing in the credits, this is the first episode of Doctor Who in which, well, Doctor Who does not appear. William Hartnell, as we know, had a couple of unscheduled breaks from the making of Marco Polo, but nonetheless still made it to the required episodes, even if his participation was minimised. This time, however, he becomes the first of the regulars to take a holiday, having worked on Doctor Who for 3 months now. Later, when the lead actor needs to take a break, the show goes to great lengths to ensure his contribution is pre-filmed, or that he at least features in the cliffhanger reprise or as a voice-off. But for the first time, this week and next, the eponymous character/lead actor does not physically appear at all, an occurrence only repeated once more in the show's history, and then for the atypical Mission to the Unknown in 1965, in which none of the regulars appear as the result of a contractual anomaly, and therefore a slightly different case. This isn't, though, the last time the Doctor is not in an episode. He misses the middle 2 instalments of The Massacre, but the actor who plays him still appears, with William Hartnell playing and credited as the Abbot of Amboise instead. Indeed, that means that these 2 episodes are the only time in the show's history that the character of the Doctor is not featured in the credits. But back to Season 1, Jacqueline Hill will take a holiday soon, and will be absent from a couple of episodes of The Censorites, but by the time Carol Ann Ford and William Russell take their sabbaticals, their absence will be covered by pre-filming. As we noted last episode, the setting for the Screaming Jungle is meant to be a ruined city, although its on-screen manifestation could just as easily represent a remote location. The proverbial cabin in the woods, in other words. Carol Ann Ford reenacts the closing seconds of The Velvet Web for the brief reprise that opens this instalment. Stage directions indicate that Barbara should place her arm around Susan, but it's Ian who clasps her shoulders on screen. As the travellers explore their surroundings, Robin Phillips gets a bit of extra dialogue by cribbing the end of one of William Russell's speeches. "Some of them are almost as thick as small trees," was originally Ian's line. With hindsight, Susan's dialogue about not liking to say goodbye takes on an importance that probably wasn't intended at this point in the programme's development. Nonetheless, it's an intriguing foreshadowing of the circumstances that will surround her departure in the Dalek invasion of Earth, with the Doctor locking her out of the TARDIS because he knows that she'll never willingly leave him, not even to build a new life with David Campbell. Susan's claim to having heard the plant's screeching noise once before seems like an unresolved thread in the Screaming Jungle. 2 stories later, however, in the 2nd episode of The Censorites, Susan will describe the time that she and the Doctor landed on the planet Esto, where the plants communicate by thought transference and make a screeching noise when they recognise the presence of another mind. More than 6 decades later, we have no way to know whether this was an attempt by David Whittaker to tie up the dangling reference from the Screaming Jungle, or simply a case of happenstance on the part of Peter R. Newman, the writer of The Censorites. But if the jungle flora does communicate psychically like the vegetation of Esto, it might explain why the noise begins when Susan arrives and seems to overwhelm her to such an extent, whereas Darius will later indicate that it starts at nightfall, and Ian and Barbara don't seem particularly bothered by it. Maybe the plant life recognises Susan's latent psychic abilities and is attempting to establish mental contact. The liana vine which attacks Susan is even more animated in Terry Nation's script. When Barbara grabs it, it's meant to writhe in her hands, although this may have been expecting rather too much of the poor stagehand manipulating the plant on a wire. Some scripted business between Barbara and Susan is lost in the aftermath of the attack. Barbara smiles at Susan. Susan gives a little smile in return. Nation then indicates that Barbara is worried by what happened, but determined not to show Susan. As Barbara advances up the tunnel, Terry Nation's stage directions propose, "If possible, see Barbara from the other end of the tunnel." However, John Gorrie decides to stay on camera 1's shot depicting Barbara from behind. The tunnel isn't very long, so it might be surmised that the inclusion of another perspective would make for some very rapid cutting by the standards of 1964. It would also force camera 3, which has been positioned near the end of the tunnel to Barbara's right, to hastily switch from a long shot up the tunnel to a close medium shot of the idol. Speaking of the idol, its screen manifestation only partially reflects its description on the page. "Its arms are open as though to embrace someone," Terry Nation begins, and so far so good. But then we're told, "Above its hideous head is a container filled with precious stones, bangles, ropes of pearls, etc. On top of all, there is one of the keys of Marinus." The baubles are absent from Raymond Cusick's design, with the conscience key instead dangling from the idol's head. Unfortunately, with Props Builders Design and Display Limited having apparently followed Cusick's instruction to give the surface of the idol a sheen of very old gold, he also suggested green jade and marble glass as potential alternatives, it's very hard for the viewer to recognise the key until Barbara identifies it. Ian's return isn't quite mounted as the script would have it. Terry Nation seems to have imagined a wider shot, since he indicates that Susan should race over to Ian with relief, and once he learns that Barbara has ventured down the tunnel, Ian runs to the archway. On screen, that he's almost adjacent to Susan at the mouth of the tunnel when he announces his presence. It's at this stage that Ian refers to the conscience key as a micro-key, whereas Arbitan in the Sea of Death had called them key microcircuits, and Barbara, earlier in this scene, had referred to the key, the microcircuit, although this was scripted as the key of the microcircuit. Ian's clearly a techno-jargon influencer because, just like travel dial in the Sea of Death, micro-key will suddenly be on everybody's lips for the rest of the keys of Marinus. The script suggests a bit more business for Barbara as she tries to recover the key. Before she clambers up onto the idol, Barbara stretches upward, but it remains beyond her grasp. In the recorded episode, it's difficult to discern what triggers the idol trap. Camera 2 is meant to give a close shot on Barbara's feet as she stands on tiptoe. She rests one foot on a slight projection. Lever-like, it clicks down. There is a rumble of creaking machinery. A similar stage direction accompanies Ian's later reactivation of the trap. In both cases, Jacqueline Hill and William Russell do seem to dip slightly. It's easier to notice when Ian's atop the statue, but only the most perceptive of viewers would be left with anything more than the impression that it's simply their contact with the idol that sets the mechanism in motion. Barbara is meant to try, unsuccessfully, to stop the idol's arms from ensnaring her, although this may have been rendered impossible to stage because, as we discussed in The When, Jacqueline Hill is positioned higher on the statue than originally intended. The placement of the idol's arms is clearly very different from Terry Nation's imaginings, because a stage direction states that the arms completely encompass Barbara, pressing her head against the statue. With Ian having decided to stay behind and look for Barbara while the others depart for the location of the next key, the script simply indicates that Susan and Altos vanish in the usual way. It might be inferred that Nation is operating under the assumption that a routine visual effect would have been established by now, but in fact, the usual way is rather less sophisticated. A convenient cut to an onlooker and a sound effect to cover the actors as they move out of shot before the camera cuts back. In the script, Sabitha struggles to activate her travel dial because she's hampered by trying to hold the key in the hand with which she operates the dial. A recording break accompanies Ian's triggering of the idol trap and his subsequent transportation through the wall via a turntable supplied to Design and Display Limited by the BBC. This pause allows the cast and the cameras to be repositioned on the courtyard set. Of the small, open courtyard, Terry Nation indicates that there should be some alcoves and dark openings around the walls. There is a large doorway into the house at one end. In the courtyard are some strange sculptures, suggesting a former elegance, now lost and crumbling in the decay of time. Ian's course takes him past the base of a large statue. It is of a grotesquely uniformed warrior. Its arms are raised about its head, holding a huge, fierce-looking battle-axe. On screen, the armour isn't noticeably grotesque. The battle-axe has been swapped for a longsword, and actor Martin Court is allowed to assume a more relaxed stance, perhaps because it would be hard for him to hold still for long in his scripted position, or perhaps because it makes for more obvious and dramatic action when Ian triggers the trap. As scripted, we see the great battle-axe in the statue's hands draw back slightly, preparing to strike. There's a great stage direction as Ian and Barbara observe the flora encroaching on the courtyard. The vegetation is very still and silent, writes Terry Nation, which, yes, certainly makes sense in story terms, but try to imagine the baffled reaction if that direction popped up in a script for, say, Coronation Street. The hall in which we first glimpse Darius is even more overrun by plant life in the script. Nation first describes a barred window opposite the door. The glass is broken. A large branch has pushed through. also a number of creepers. Grass has grown over the sill of the window and has spread down the wall and across some of the floor. The furniture in the room has been thrown about, and the vines have twined around it, crushing the legs of a chair in one case. Tendrils have crept under the door. The wall surrounding the window has fungus and fleshy orchid-like plants growing on it. For his part, Darius is simply an old man, in a robe like the one worn by Arbitan in episode 1. In the script, his name is consistently spelled with one R, although it's double R in the transmitted credits. After he's been trapped behind the portcullis, Ian is meant to be rather more vigorous in his attempts to dislodge the grate. It remains very solid despite the shaking he gives it. He tries to pull it up, using all his strength, straining desperately. There is no movement. Sadly, the artifice behind Ian's use of a pickhead to prise the bars apart is spoiled when the lathe on the right of the screen immediately wobbles, since it clearly isn't fixed to the horizontal bar above it. The barbed ceiling is a miniature on which camera 4 is focused. It isn't a working prop. The effect of the ceiling lowering towards Barbara is achieved by having the camera smoothly push in. As Barbara struggles with the netting, Terry Nation intends the shot to be composed differently. The interior door is slightly open. Peering unemotionally through the crack is Darius. Instead, we have to settle for the rather awkward presence of the hem of Darius's robe in the corner of the screen. As scripted, he does not approach Barbara until after he's decided to stop the descent of the barbed ceiling. Darius's speculation about whether Barbara is a Vord raises some intriguing questions. He specifically indicates that the Vord are a race of people to which Barbara bears no resemblance, and yet he seems to accept that it's possible that she could be a Vord nonetheless. Does he mean that she might be a follower of Yartek? Or is this a fragment of the idea espoused in Terry Nation's brief storyline that the Vord have become susceptible to the conscience of Marinus because they've now spent many centuries integrating themselves into the native population? A few other questions are raised by the exchange between Barbara and Darius. In the Sea of Death, Arbitan claimed that he was the only person who knew the location of all the keys, and yet Darius's method for verifying that Barbara is really working for Arbitan is to check that her travel dial has been programmed with the correct route to find them. Is Darius bluffing? Likewise, Darius will shortly make a deathbed assertion that only agents of Arbitan would have been warned to avoid his traps. Since Barbara and Ian have been bungling into one trap after another, it's understandable that Darius doubts Barbara's honesty. But why wouldn't Arbitan have mentioned the traps to the TARDIS crew before they left his island at the end of the Sea of Death? For that matter, why didn't he warn Sabetha or Altos at the start of their journeys? Their travel dials are evidently programmed with the location of every key. In the Velvet Web, Altos says that his friend Yprin jumped ahead to search for the fourth key, and there's no obvious opportunity to reprogram Sabetha's travel dial before they depart from Morphoton at the end of that episode. So it seems reasonable to assume that Arbitan expected them to carry on and collect the remaining keys as well. Of course, there's no way to definitively answer any of these questions. Too much information will operate under the assumption that they mask a fascinatingly complex and cohesive backstory to the Keys of Marinus and aren't just the perfectly understandable symptoms of a writer churning out 6 television scripts at breakneck speed. If the jungle's attack on Darius seems a little abrupt, that isn't the way Terry Nation envisaged it. As written, the scene begins with Darius at work on a bench. In other words, he's examining the travel dial's programming as he suggested to Barbara. Through a window behind Darius, we see a vine creeping in. It goes around his neck, and Darius struggles with it. This is where the broadcast episode picks up the action. We've already seen vines torment Susan and hover menacingly behind Barbara, but the extent of the attack on Darius seems to have been too complex to be realised as live on the studio floor. Also dropped from the scripted action is a shot of Ian outside Darius's abode as he pushes in the door with the heel of his shoe on the lock. The stage directions don't indicate that the barbed ceiling should retreat as it does on screen, so Ian then drags Barbara away from the spikes before helping her remove the netting. The rescue of Darius exhibits some differences between script and screen. We see him in a standing position, being pulled against the window, but he is written to be helpless on the floor, wrapped around with 3 of the lianas. One is wound around his throat. He claws at it. As Ian hacks at the lianas with the machete, the main stems withdraw through the window. Only at this stage does Barbara appear in the room, and she and Ian unwind the lianas from around him. As they help Darius to bed, Darius finds the effort needed to speak enormous. His voice is a croak. After the old man delivers his warning about the whispering, Darius groans and closes his eyes. Barbara and Ian exchange glances. The ensuing fade to black doesn't denote a recording break in this instance. It's just an artistic choice to emphasise a scripted time lapse. When the story resumes, stage directions suggest that Darius's head is bandaged. One side of the bandage is covered in blood. Presumably, this was omitted because there was no opportunity for him to incur a head wound if Edmund Warwick's performance no longer involved his being dragged to the floor by the vines. Unfortunately, the gravity of Barbara's concern that Darius is dying winds up being slightly undercut when camera 1, panning right as it follows Ian from the side of the room to the old man's bedside, bangs noisily into a part of the set. The aftermath of Darius's death is somewhat different in the script. Barbara stands and turns away as Ian covers the old man with the blanket. Instead, it's Barbara who starts to cover Darius with the blanket as Ian lowers his eyelids. Likewise, it's Ian and not Barbara who's meant to open the door to the laboratory. Darius's inner sanctum has been converted from an ordinary domestic room, according to the stage directions. One indication of its former use is the open fireplace. There is a large quantity of glass equipment pertaining to chemistry. Walls are lined with storage jars. Huge luxuriant specimen plants grow in pots. The window of this room is also boarded over. We see the stone blocks of the untreated walls. The more dilapidated end of the set has been constructed by Shawcraft to come apart when the jungle attacks at the story's climax, with company representatives on hand to operate it. This time, the fade to black that accompanies Ian and Barbara's decision to search the room does mask a recording break, so that the set can be redressed to reflect the thoroughness of their hunt for the key. The room is in disarray, says the script. Drawers lie emptied on the floor. Papers are scattered about. Everything that can be opened has been. Barbara sits exhausted in the midst of it. As the whispering gets louder, it's meant to be joined by a tapping noise. This is what provokes Barbara's line about it sounding
like someone trying to get in.
The cacophony is eventually supposed to reach ear-shattering level. The onslaught is even more violent in the script, which includes a shot in which Ian and Barbara stare in terror as they see the huge stone blocks of the wall being forced inwards. There's a peculiarity in the script when it comes to DE302, and yes, we don't just mean the fact that this is a made-up chemical formula. Granted, O appears on our periodic table, where it represents oxygen, and while you won't find D there, it is often used to denote deuterium, a stable isotope of hydrogen. As for E, or possibly DE, if the 2 letters are meant to symbolise a single element, well, you'd need to track down a chemist from Marinus to explain that one. And right now the Too Much Information budget can only afford a mathematician from Newfoundland. But what's stranger is that the first smashed beaker that Ian spots, labelled NH4NO3 on screen, bears the legend DE302 in the script, which is precisely Darius's clue. NH4NO3, on the other hand, is a real chemical formula which describes the fertiliser, otherwise known as ammonium nitrate. Then, when Barbara locates the container which holds the key, the stage direction describes it as a jar of ammonium nitrate. The implication seems to be that DE302 is the notation for ammonium nitrate on Marinus, and that there are several jars of it in Darius's laboratory, and that the cutaway to the jar labelled NH4NO3 is in error. So, whereas the on-screen action suggests that Darius's laboratory contains just a single beaker of DE302, and inside it is the key. The intention appears to be that Ian and Barbara are looking amongst many such jars for the right one. This, then, is a much more fraught hunt for the proverbial needle in the haystack that, had it been clearly communicated to the viewer, would have substantially ratcheted up the tension of the episode's climax. Throughout all of this, the jungle's attack is meant to be frenetic. After Ian realises that DE302 is a chemical formula, the blocks in the wall fall forwards, and a huge branch shoves through. Shortly thereafter, a liana lashes down from above onto them. When Barbara finds the key, the noise is terrific. More liana fall on them, as much vegetation and destruction in the room as possible. They fight against the lianas, which are falling around them thick and fast. The staging of the scene relies heavily on Jack Brummett's effective sound design, while the attacking lianas are reduced to a couple of lazily swinging vines, one of which William Russell half-heartedly swats aside. Ian and Barbara's escape from the screaming jungle also represents the first time that we actually follow characters through the process of activating their travel dials and arriving at their destination. Previously, we either caught up with them subsequent to their materialization, or they entered the shot after arriving off-screen. To facilitate this new perspective, a recording break provides an opportunity for William Russell and Jacqueline Hill to move from the laboratory set to the snow-covered rock face. The action of this scene differs from the script, where Ian and Barbara materialise a little distance apart. Barbara has fallen in the snow. Ian makes his way to her. Despite his absence from the screaming jungle, William Hartnell still receives an end credit as Doctor Who. This will be the normal practice when the regular cast is on holiday, although, as we'll see when we get to the Web Planet, it won't be followed absolutely religiously, and not everyone will be happy about that. The Who. Catherine Schofield. Catherine Schofield, playing Sabitha in The Keys of Marinus, was born Elizabeth Mary Cunliffe on the 24th of July 1940 in Watford, the daughter of bacteriologist Tony Cunliffe, who was a professor at King's College London, and his wife Mary, née O'Toole, who had been a dancer. Catherine also had a younger brother Jonathan, who arrived 4 years later. As a youngster, she took part in a nativity play with professional and non-professional actors and decided a life on the stage was for her, although she left school at 16 and worked first as an au pair in France for 6 months and was fluent in the language. This was because her parents were very against her going on stage, and indeed, they then sent her to secretarial college, but she dropped out and, defiantly and off her own back, auditioned for LAMDA, the London Academy of Music and Dramatic Arts, and applied for a scholarship to pay her fees, which she won. She had known aspirant historical demographer Roger Schofield when she was young, as she was best friends with his sister at secondary school. The girls even used to go on holiday together. By chance, when she was 19, she was posting a letter in London in the very same postbox that he had arrived at concurrently, and the two recognised each other and got talking. They subsequently married when she was 21, on September the 3rd, 1961, while he was studying for his PhD and she was at LAMDA. At this point, she was known as Elizabeth Schofield. Roger got his PhD in 1963, the same year Elizabeth's acting career began, and indeed, Doctor Who started. She changed her name for professional purposes to Catherine, with an A, as it is spelt on Doctor Who, although over the years, and it seems generally to be when this is a mistake on the production team's part, it was sometimes rendered with the more usual E, and even on one occasion was Catherine with a C. But whatever the spelling, it's always her. Upon graduation, she joined the Welsh Theatre Company, initially hired as a stage manager, filling in the odd role. The company eventually acknowledged that she was too good to be languishing backstage, and so her professional debut proper came in The Semi-Detached with Lee Montague.
We were playing to full houses nearly every night, and at certain points in the play we had the audience laughing for 20 minutes at a stretch. I always remember thinking to myself, this is it. This is how it should be.
She was living with Roger and based in Cambridge when she was cast in Doctor Who, which was only her second telly after a 1963 episode of No Hiding Place, directed by future Whoer Peter Moffat. After her jaunt to Marinus, there was a Christopher Morrihan-directed armchair theatre, Exit Joe running, a Wednesday play, Autostop, and episodes of The Avengers, the classic The Cybernauts, although her Turner's Oyuka is, unfortunately, uncredited. There's Dixon of Dock Green, a couple of The Saint, and a Virgin of the Secret Service. After beating off competition from over 200 hopefuls, Catherine was cast in the title role in 1968's Nana, which was BBC Two's first full-colour production, based on Émile Zola's classic tale about a 19th century courtesan. It was directed by John Davis, who, like Catherine, had previous one-off form in time and space, having directed Patrick Troughton's The Macra Terror.
Human animality, debauchery, lechery, adultery, lewdness, ribaldry, sensuality, crudeness, coarseness, corruption, and plain, ordinary, everyday, morning, noon, and night prostitution is not often assembled in a single television presentation, said the San Francisco Examiner when the show hit the States. But despite its shock, it acknowledged that the production was excellent, whilst noting that whilst the real Nana was a larger lady, as was fashionable at the time, that Schofield has the kind of decadently svelte figure currently admired in London, this being a BBC production.
It was dubbed in the press as TV's first female nudity.
The fuss and furore that was made,
recalled Catherine later.
People always asking me how I feel when I take my clothes off in public, and unless I say I was shy and horrified, they're not satisfied. It's true to a certain extent, you do. But if it is what the part really requires, then it is worth doing.
She grew somewhat tired of being asked about the nude scenes in Nana, but was aware of the pitfalls of an acting career. She determined to be very philosophical about acting and the possibility of stardom, vital, she felt, in order to remain sane in a tricky business. She found that being married to someone outside of show business was a big help in this regard. And Roger was by now a Cambridge don, and was indeed present during the making of Nana. John Davis remembers that
he often sat in our control room, taking a great interest.
He wasn't fazed by the nudity, according to Catherine.
Roger isn't the least bit embarrassed. He won't be seeing me on the screen, but Nana.
Davis felt he'd found the right Nana in Catherine.
I first saw her in a Fringe production and was immediately impressed by her talent and sheer glamour,
he told Too Much Information recently.
She also, I found, had great courage, which was certainly going to be necessary, as Zola's Nana was pushing the boundaries for the BBC in 1968. Full nudity, prostitution, the first same-sex kiss on television. She very quickly realised what she was letting herself in for and embraced it. The rest of the cast loved her for it and supported her throughout the production. The BBC hierarchy was shocked by the first episode, and pressure was put on us to make cuts in the following episodes, which we ignored. Huge viewing figures and a couple of BAFTA nominations were our reward.
When Nana was repeated on BBC One a couple of years later, she was also appearing as another woman of ill repute, a mistress no less, in The Hero. But she didn't worry about typecasting.
I wish I would get typecast. Apart from the money, fallen women roles really give one something to get involved in.
She had a major role in the film Nicholas and Alexandra for Sam Spiegel.
We spent 6 months in Madrid filming it. And at one point we spent a whole day or more in a train carriage, which for the purpose of the film was crashed into a wall. The thing was, something wasn't going right, and we did it over and over again. I kept getting a balalaika up my nose.
Roger and Catherine had a daughter, Melanie, in 1972, but Catherine was soon back at work. In The Colour of Blood, a 1973 episode of Thriller, she had to perform with live rats in scenes which were not for the faint-hearted, but Schofield was made of sterner stuff.
I really don't understand why people find them so frightening. They are lovely little things.
She appeared in The Naked Civil Servant, the Terence Davis trilogy, Life Force, and The Lion in Africa, and her last screen appearance was as Aunt Grace in the BBC's serial of Tom's Midnight Garden in 1989. That same year, she took the iconic role of Lady Bracknell for the Everyman Theatre in Gloucester, which she played accompanied on stage every night by two very well-behaved Bichon Frise dogs. She also gave Bracknell a Sloaney twang.
It's a voice I hear every day in Knightsbridge bars and Harrods.
She and Roger separated in the mid-70s but remained on good terms, and from 1980 she was the long-term companion of the television producer Bernard Thompson, last of the Summer Wine, Are You Being Served, and remained his partner until his death in 1998, although she and Roger didn't divorce until 1999. Aside from acting, when Melanie was taking her A-levels, Catherine decided to do one as well, in art, and passed with flying colours.
She was really good at everything she turned her hand to,
remembers Melanie. She was also an avid dog rescuer and sitter.
There was never a dull moment,
says Melanie. Catherine sadly became ill with ovarian cancer, which she battled for some time before dying aged just 62 on the 6th of August 2002. Melanie, who has helped us to ensure that all our details about Catherine are correct in this podcast, despite what you may read on various internet resources, says of her mum,
"She was a life force. You knew when she was in the room would light up. She wouldn't hold back with what she thought. She was thoughtful, very kind, very intelligent, quite talkative, good fun, and a fun mum. She was a really good actress and a really good mum."
And so ends another episode of Doctor Who. And look, let's not be coy. Far more than the Sea of Death or the Velvet Web, the script for The Screaming Jungle bears the telltale signs of the haste with which it was written. It's littered with half-formed notions and ideas that don't quite tie together. Susan recognising the jungle noises is an eerie portent of, well, absolutely nothing. The vegetation's accelerated life cycle gives stray creepers the ability to specifically target Susan and Darius for no better reason than the need to punctuate the action with a new moment of jeopardy. A form of life which feeds on sunshine waits until nightfall to be active, and perhaps most glaring of all is Darius's assertion that Arbitan would have made his agents aware of the traps he set. It's a wonder that Ian and Barbara don't give Yartek a little pat on the back for disposing of the forgetful scientist when they return to his island in episode 6. But despite its weaknesses, the Screaming Jungle still finds a way to break new ground. Having already got the Doctor out of the way at the end of the previous week's instalment, Terry Nation wastes little time shuffling Susan, Sabitha and Altos off to the snows of terror. The result is a premonition of the fully fledged companion pieces that would become more common in 21st century Doctor Who, with the likes of Turn Left or The Girl Who Waited or 73 Yards. And indeed, the rapport between Ian and Barbara is the highlight of the episode. There are the obvious hero-heroine dynamics, as they prod each other to solve Darius's dying riddle and survive the onslaught of the homicidal horticulture. But there are also some lovely, quieter moments. Barbara's fond look back as she makes up her mind to defy Ian's instruction not to do anything while he's exploring the wall. Her gentle chiding as he becomes absorbed in Darius's journal. William Russell and Jacqueline Hill are so good at playing the daring protagonists of these early Doctor Who adventures that it's sometimes easy to overlook the nuance they bring to their roles, elevating their involvement far beyond cookie-cutter adventure serial performances. And for all that The Screaming Jungle is rather a pedestrian narrative, it has to be said that the crew really strives to make far more of these meagre ingredients than they might justly deserve. It's such an unsettling half-hour of television, with much of the heavy lifting accomplished by Raymond Cusick's atmospheric sets and Jack Brummett's eerie sound. The jungle background really does look nigh impenetrable, and the ruined state of Darius's residence does a better job of conveying the shambles of the man's mind than Edmund Warwick's doddery performance. The weird statue that traps Barbara, the strange night that nearly cleaves Ian in two, the unearthly howls of the encroaching vegetation, Cusick
Brummett, and the other designers make a virtue of their limited resources to produce a setting on the edge of nightmare. And we can't discount Terry Nation's contributions here either. Susan's comment about the familiarity of the weird noises may turn out to be a non sequitur, but it leaves us more than a little intrigued and more than a little discomforted. And when Sabitha intones, "This is a dead place," only the most jaded of viewers will fail to feel a frisson of dread travel up their spine. Oh, and nature has a fixed tempo of destruction. Doctor Who, The Screaming Jungle, featured Martin Court as Warrior and Edmund Warwick as Darius. The title music was by Ron Grainer with the BBC Radiophonic Workshop. The incidental music was by Norman Kay. The story editor was David Whittaker. The designer, Raymond P. Cusick. And the associate producer was Mervyn Pinfield. Coming next, we leave behind the steamy jungle for the frozen wastes, and Doctor Who treads on some surprisingly adult territory. That's next time on Doctor Who, Too Much Information. Next episode, The Snows of Terror, or A Creep into Wolf's Clothing. Too Much Information, The Screaming Jungle, was presented by me, Toby Hadoke, from a script written by Shannon Patrick Sullivan with additional material by me. Additional voice work came courtesy of Chrissy Bone and Shirley Houston, with thanks to John Davis, Richard Bignell, David Brunt, Stephen Griffiths, Ben Jolly, Kral Thal, and extra special thanks to Melanie Nicholson. The music for Too Much Information was specially composed by Wayne Shepherd. There is a supplemental podcast, one per story as opposed to per episode, Far Too Much Information, that is for now exclusive to patrons, who also qualify for bonus material, early releases and other exclusives, as well as pictures of my dog. Patrons are also nearly 6 months ahead with my Happy Times and Places podcast, so if you want to hear comedian Oliver Double on Planet of the Ood, or writer Mark Wright on The Ambassadors of Death, which has had some of the best feedback of any podcast I've ever done, then head to patreon.com/Toby Hadoke. References. Too Much Information would, of course, contain far too little information if it weren't for the wealth of original scripts and production paperwork that has been unearthed and collated over the years. My debt to those responsible for this Herculean effort is beyond description. On the other hand, you'll note that many of the details about Catherine Schofield in this differ from those available online, an object lesson in not treating, for example, IMDb as a reliable source. At the time of recording, it has the wrong place and dates of Catherine's birth and death, and even the official Ancestry website, updated by a researcher with the word Who in their handle, had incorrectly conflated our Catherine with another Catherine with similar birth and death dates, confusion which has then spread out, sort of everywhere. Too Much Information is confident about the research herein, and indeed Ancestry has now been updated as a result of these endeavours, although is still not entirely correct at the time of recording. Now, these researches involved essentially starting from scratch, a little luck and a lot of digging. So no, I think you'll find messages, please. The production subtitles on BBC Video's DVD of The Keys of Marinus were written by Richard Molesworth and are a treasure trove of insight and information. Newly available from Telos Publishing is the Doctor Who Production Diary Volume 1, The Hartnell Years by David Brunt, the deepest dive ever undertaken into the surviving documentation that depicts the making of Doctor Who. This goldmine of day-to-day details will let you feel as though you're sitting in the office in 1964, peering over the shoulders of Verity Lambert and David Whittaker. The Doctor Who Production Diary is the latest addition to a small library of splendid reference works that chronicle the earliest days of Doctor Who. They span Jeremy Bentham's pioneering Doctor Who the early years, to the titanic tag team of Doctor Who the 60s and Doctor Who the Handbook, The First Doctor, by David J. Howe, Mark Stammers and Stephen James Walker, to the indispensable Doctor Who, The Complete History, Volume 2, edited by John Ainsworth. The Complete History boasts contributions from Jonathan Morris, Richard Atkinson, Mark Wright and Alistair McGowan, and of course it builds upon the archives published in Doctor Who magazine and written by Andrew Pixley. The archive for The Keys of Marinus can be found in issue 310, with updates in the 7th instalment of the Doctor Who magazine special edition. Also a vital resource in the pages of Doctor Who magazine is the Fact of Fiction, for which Jonathan Morris studied The Keys of Marinus in issue 445. And a discussion of relevant periodicals cannot end without an acknowledgement of the premier magazine of Doctor Who research, Richard Bignell's Nothing at the End of the Lane. Occupying its corner of the World Wide Web for 28 years and counting is Doctor Who, A Brief History of Time, open brackets, travel, close brackets. There, Shannon Patrick Sullivan provides another account of the making of the Keys of Marinus, although this one is rather more, well, brief, as it says on the tin. I walk in the shadows of giants, giants whose remote controls must have supersized pause buttons so that they can scrutinise archival television, frame by frame. I'm grateful to the patrons who make these podcasts possible, and they include Sydney Wilson, David James Wilson, Andrew Willis, Rhys Williams, Michael Williams, Tom White, Stephen White, Adam Westwood, Nick Tedston, Neil Tate, Richard Straw, Gavin McLean, Christopher Meredith, Rob Leonard, Ronald Hayden, Peter Harness, James Curray Smith, Peter Burns, Ruben Herfindahl, and Stephen Moffat. Not that one, a different one. If you would like to join that list of people, then go to patreon.com/Toby Hadoke, where, as mentioned, you can get early releases, bonus material, all sorts of extra goodies, including behind-the-scenes looks at the various DVD and Blu-ray features in which I take part. Patronage starts for as little as £3 a month, and you get everything of real consequence there. All the audio and visual releases are available at the lowest tier, £3 a month, and you can get 10% off that, and indeed off any tier, if you sign up for a year in one go. You might also wish to support these, or alternatively, do so by going to kofi.com/Toby Hadoke, where you can make a one-off donation at any time to ensure that I can keep these ad-free and recorded properly, in good time and on proper equipment. And if you can't or are disinclined to do that, that's totally understandable. I'm very grateful to you for listening. Then perhaps you could do what costs you nothing, and that's to go to Podbean, Spotify, iTunes, Apple, wherever you get your podcasts, and give these 5 stars and a few lines of descriptive review to encourage more people to come and listen to them. And you could also go to social media, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, anywhere you like, to spread the word about Toby Hadoke's time travels, too much information, happy times and places, indefinable magic, and any other bits and pieces of my output. I'm on Twitter, @Toby Hadoke, and these podcasts have their own account, @Hadoke Podcasts. I'm also on Instagram, @Toby.Hadoke. I have a Facebook page, and my website is www.tobyhadoke.com. I record this in the week of the passing of William Russell. What a lovely man he was. And indeed, Annika Wills phoned me today to have a chat about him, because she's like that. And we were discussing what it was that we liked about him so much. She thought he was an absolute gent and a very, very good actor. She was right on both counts. And we were chatting about what it was, and I said, I think there's something about his performance that he really needed, both on screen and in terms of what he lent to the episode as a contributor. And that was the quality of unflappability. He was many things. He was charming, he was dynamic, he was always believable, he was very real, he was very solid. But that unflappability,
that you really needed in both Ian and in William Russell, I think is a particular asset that made him very special. And I only raise it because Annika went, oh yes, unflappable. That's definitely what he was. So let's raise a glass, and on behalf of Annika as well, who is sort of de facto involved in this little post-credit salutation. William Russell, Ian Chesterton, 1924 to 2024, just a few months short of his 100th birthday. Oh, silly old fusspot.